Hello and welcome to the Theoria channel, where we look at the ancient manuscripts of the Bible and then ask, what was it that the authors of this literature were trying to say to their audience? Here are two fragments from two separate copies of the book of Genesis found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. They were likely made somewhere around a few decades before the birth of Jesus, and they each have a little bit of the passage that we're going to look at in this video. And that is a couple lines of dialogue from the story of Joseph found in Genesis chapter 41, verses 38 and 39. And on this fragment, we see a little bit of verse 38. V'yimer Perao. And he said, Pharaoh. And on this one, we see a little bit of verse 39. Hodia Elohim, or God has made known. Now here is the same passage in the Leningrad Codex. This manuscript is the starting point for almost all English translations of the Old Testament. And as you can see, it's much more readable. And here we have, V'yomer Parao el Avidayu. And he said, Pharaoh, to his servants. Now, before we go any further with the translation, we need to consider the context. Then we can work out what was it that the author of this literature was actually trying to communicate. Trying to come up with the exact historical situation in which the book of Genesis was written is challenging, to say the least. There is a number of reasons for this, and there are no shortage of theories that biblical scholars have come up with, some of which include written just after the Exodus, written during the early monarchy, or written just after the exile. And there are all kinds of complicated nuances to each of these theories that attempt to explain the phenomenon of the text that we have, such as discussions about sources and redactions and editors. But for our purposes, I don't think it would be helpful to go into any lengthy explanation of any of that here. The most relevant thing for us is to note that the book of Genesis was written for Israelites, to provide them with a national narrative and an identity. Another important thing to keep in mind is that all the stories in the book of Genesis take place in the author's distant past, even if you do take the earliest possible date for its authorship. And just for fun and to illustrate this point, let's just say that Moses wrote the book of Genesis while the Israelites were leaving Egypt. And let's just take one of the more popular dates, around 1270 BCE, for the Exodus. So during the early part of the reign of Pharaoh Ramses II. And we'll take Exodus 1240 as being accurate. So 430 years will put the Joseph story at around 1700 BCE. This is during the Middle Bronze Age 2B. In Egypt, this would be during what Egyptologists call the Second Intermediate Period. At this time in Egypt, the Hyksos had a kingdom in the Nile Delta region, with the capital at Avaris. Now, just to get some perspective on the length of this span of time that stretches between Joseph and Moses, 430 years ago from today would be 1592. That would be at the tail end of the European Renaissance. This is a longer period of time than what is typically covered in any college U.S. history textbook. Just think of all the generations of people that would have lived and died and how much the world has changed since 1592. All that history would fit into this gap between the stories of Joseph and Moses. So even if you go with Moses as the author, the stories in the book of Genesis would still have been for Moses in the very distant past. Now, the stories in the book of Genesis are what we can call, literarily speaking, myth and legend, not in the sense of something untrue, but in the sense of a story that provides a conceptual framing for the reader's current situation. In other words, these are stories intended to give the reader a way to understand why the world is the way it is, as well as an understanding of their place in it. The book of Genesis would provide to any ancient Israelite reading it answers to the questions, what does it mean to be a human? What does it mean to be an Israelite? What makes the Israelites different from any other nation? And it also answers the question why the Israelites were in Egypt in the first place, and why it was important for them to leave Egypt and migrate to the promised land of Canaan. When people think of the book of Genesis, some of the first things that often come to mind are stuff like Adam and Eve and Noah's Ark. But when you look at the literary work as a whole, you can see that all the stuff that people tend to obsess over is actually only prologue to the main story. In fact, the stuff that makes up the first 11 chapters of Genesis are stories of the kind that were somewhat ubiquitous across the cultures of the ancient Near East. and the purpose of these stories were to set the stage for the main event. So they are a statement about the way the world is, and that is a state of corruption and rebellion. Rebellion against God from both humans and celestial beings resulted in a world full of suffering and violence. Humans have been divided up into nations with different languages and worshiping gods other than the Creator. The rest of the story of Genesis is the Creator's solution to this state of affairs. As the story goes, God chose Abraham, and from Abraham, God would make a nation for himself that would be loyal to him and worship him and not any other deity. And to the descendants of Abraham, God promised to give the land of Canaan. Now, the second half of the book of Genesis is the story of Jacob and his 12 sons. And in that story, God changes Jacob's name to Israel. And the largest portion of this section of the book is made up of the story of Joseph. So the story of Joseph makes up the largest segment of the book of Genesis. So the answer to the question, what is an Israelite, that is offered by the book of Genesis is one who is descended from one of the 12 sons of Israel, who himself was descended from Abraham, an heir to the promise that God made to him. And the story of Joseph provides an explanation for how the Israelites ended up in Egypt in the first place. The passage we're going to be looking at comes from the Joseph story. And just to give a very terse synopsis of the story, out of Israel's 12 sons, Joseph was the second youngest, and greatly favored by his father. Joseph's jealous brothers sold him to slavers and told their father that Joseph was dead. After Joseph spent time as a slave in Egypt and time in prison on account of a false accusation, he would eventually find himself before Pharaoh, who wanted Joseph to give him an interpretation to a troubling dream that he had had. Joseph prayed to God for the interpretation, and God revealed the dream's meaning to Joseph. The dream meant that Egypt would experience 7 years of great prosperity and bountiful harvests, followed by 7 years of great famine. Then Joseph suggested to Pharaoh the solution of building storehouses and filling them with provisions during the 7 years of prosperity, so Egypt could not only endure the coming famine, but could sell food during that time, making Egypt rich. Pharaoh liked this idea and put Joseph in charge of carrying out this plan. And not only that, he elevated Joseph to ruler over all Egypt, second only to Pharaoh. And during the time of the famine, Joseph's father, along with the rest of his family, would migrate to Egypt to buy food. So because of the Joseph story, Israel and his 12 sons end up in Egypt, being saved from starvation. Now, the couple of verses that we're going to be looking at are 2 lines of dialogue spoken by Pharaoh just after Joseph laid out his plan for saving Egypt from the coming famine. V'yomer Parao el Avidayu. And he said, Pharaoh, to his servants, Hanimsa katzeh, ish asher ruach Elohim bo. Who can find, like this, a man, such that, the breath of God in him? V'yomer Parao el Yosef. And he said, Pharaoh, to Joseph, Acharei hudia Elohim, otka et kol zot, ein navon, v'hakam kamotka. Since he made known to you, God, all this, there is none intelligent and wise like you. So Pharaoh describes Joseph as one who has the breath or spirit of God in him, and is intelligent and wise. Now, the Hebrew word ruach can literally be translated as wind or breath, although typically translated spirit. But we want to use a bit of caution here and not just impose the Christian doctrine of the third person of the Trinity onto this locution, ruach Elohim, although they are most definitely connected. We must not assume any association with this terminology that would be foreign to the mind of the author or the intended audience of this literature. Maybe it'd be helpful if I said it this way. It would be wise to first discover what the author of this text meant by Ruach Elohim, then let that inform your understanding of the Spirit of God, as opposed to starting with a fully developed religious doctrine of the Trinity and simply applying that to the terminology, Spirit of God, whenever you come across it. We want to be careful not to do eisegesis here, even if that thing that we're putting onto the text is true. In lieu of an in-depth word study of ruach, let me just point out some of the associations that would have been typical of this word that are relevant here to this passage. There is the association with life, or animating power, simply because when a person dies, the breath leaves, and with that comes the idea of endowment of power or ability. Then there's the association with speech, for it is with the breath that one speaks. And along with that comes associations with things like intellect and wisdom. And of course, the idea of God speaking is associated with creation, by means of his wisdom or his spirit. And when one speaks on behalf of someone, as their representative, there is the association with authority. So a prophet that speaks for God can be said to be speaking by means of the Ruach Elohim, and thus speaking with God's authority. Now here in the Joseph story, the character of Pharaoh, by saying that Joseph is a man with the breath of God in him, is simply saying that he is impressed that someone actually said something intelligent and useful. But the author is expecting the reader to understand this in the broader context of the book of Genesis. Let me show you what I mean. In the Joseph story, there are a few motifs. There is that he is called a man with the Spirit of God in him, and you have that Joseph spoke with wisdom, bringing order out of chaos wherever he went. In whatever circumstance Joseph found himself in, he arose to be the one in charge, second only to some higher authority, which he acted as their agent. This was the case when he was a slave as well as when he was a prisoner, and of course you see it here with Pharaoh. Now there's one other place in the book of Genesis that has all three of these same motifs. That is Genesis chapter 1. You have the Spirit of God moving over the primeval chaos waters, and then God speaks, bringing order out of chaos. And God sets up rulers to govern the various aspects of his creation, culminating in God creating the Ha-Adam, or the humans, and commissioning them to rule and subdue their assigned dominion as his agents. So the author of Genesis, by drawing the reader's mind from the Joseph story all the way back to chapter 1, is trying to signal to the reader that Joseph is a model human. That is, he exemplifies the characteristics of one who is loyal to the God who created the universe. Therefore, since the descendants of Israel were meant to be a nation with the Creator as their God, Joseph is also a model Israelite. Thus, the Joseph story is not just merely answering the question of how the Israelites ended up in Egypt in the first place, but it also provides an example of how one is to act in the world as one loyal to the Creator. The theme of how a faithful Israelite is to act in the world resonated with the Jewish people after the exile. In fact, the Joseph story inspired a whole genre of literature called court tales. These stories are told using some of the same motifs and general format of the Joseph story, typically featuring a wise Jew in the court of a pagan king. These would be works like Esther and Daniel, as well as some others found in the Second Temple literature. So then, the theology that can be drawn out of this ancient piece of literature is that God's plan for humans is still the same as it was at the beginning. He wants humans to act in the world as his agents or representatives. And like Joseph, this is irregardless of circumstance. God's people are to be empowered by his Spirit to be a light in the darkness and a voice of reason in a chaotic world of noise and madness. This is what it means to be a person with the Ruach Elohim in them. Since we are talking about things that are universal to humans, the principle can be seen at work at every level of one's life, irregardless of circumstance. In other words, this principle is scalable, so you don't have to think about trying to be God's agent on the level of nations or in some grand arc of history. You can just look at your own immediate surroundings and find that one thing that you can affect to make the situation a little better for yourself and those around you. So the question for your contemplation is this: what is that one thing that you can do in your immediate circumstance to bring order out of chaos? And like Joseph, reduce the suffering in the world by just a little bit.